Welcome to a bonus episode. We are here to give you an update on the Karen Stitt case.
We're going to remind you about the details of the case and share some news about the trial that's happening at the moment.
That's on this episode of So Much Crime.
So little time.
Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Dee. And today we are going to discuss a case we covered in our June 7th, 2024 episode. Matt Hutchison solves the Karen Stitt cold case.
We want to start by just giving everyone a reminder in case you don't remember what this case was. So this was a case that started back in 1982. So Karen Stitt was a 15-year-old girl. She lived in the Bay Area in California. She actually lived in Palo Alto, if you're familiar with the Bay Area. She actually had recently moved to Palo Alto from Pittsburgh on September 2nd, 1982. She took a bus from her home in Palo Alto to Sunnyvale, which is 2 towns over. It's probably, 15 miles at most. She went to 7-Eleven to play video games with her boyfriend, and then she went mini golfing at a local mini golf course that's in Sunnyvale. It got pretty late. It was after midnight, and her boyfriend was worried about being out past his curfew. So he left Karen for her to take the bus home alone.
But she never made it. Her body was found the next morning only about 100 yards from the bus stop. She had been sexually assaulted and also stabbed 59 times. The suspect left DNA evidence behind, but he wasn't caught. It wasn't until 2000 that her boyfriend was finally cleared, because obviously there was some suspicion over him at the time. But for decades, apparently every Sunnyvale cop was trying to solve this case. Like, this was the case that was spoken about. But it took Matt Hutchison, who in 2019, he was working as a cold case detective, and he got a tip that led to the arrest of Gary Ramirez. I know we've gone through that case like a lot, and we've given you a lot of details right now, but what I would love you all to do is actually listen to our recap and actually listen to the Matt Hutchison podcast that we are discussing. It is fascinating. The level of energy and effort he put into solving this case and the strategies he used to solve this case really was a fascinating listen.
Yeah, just for context, so that we were recapping a single episode of the Fox True Crime podcast with Emily Compagno. That podcast, which we linked to in the show notes of our Matt Hutchison episode, was just an interview that Emily did with Matt Hutchison. So you get to hear directly from him. And it's just one episode long, and then you can go listen to our recap of that episode where we discuss more details about the case.
Yeah, so in August 2022, Gary Ramirez was in fact arrested, and that's kind of where we left the podcast. But we have an update, and we thought we'd bring you that update in case you haven't seen it in the news.
Yeah, so this was front page of the local newspapers out here, and it's been making the rounds online. On Monday, February 24th of 2025, Ramirez appeared in court. He pleaded no contest to the murder of Karen Stitt. So he didn't actually plead guilty. He pleaded no contest. He is 78 years old now. And what's
the benefit of pleading no contest? Is it just that he doesn't have to go through a trial? I don't understand.
Yeah. So it means he's basically not admitting guilt in the article. So we're going to link an article from the Mercury News, the San Jose newspaper.
Because I saw that Karen Stitt's aunt was basically saying he's not admitting to it.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a cop out of sorts. So
cop out.
Yeah. So he doesn't admit guilt, but it definitely did. Yeah, it upset the relatives and friends of Karen Stitt and Karen Stitt's family, who felt like they wanted something more like justice. It does mean that he will probably spend the rest of his life in jail. So on May 12th, he will be back in court for his sentencing. It's expected that he will basically get some version of life in prison. He could technically be eligible for parole sometime in his 90s if he lives that long. But I think the hope from the family and friends is that he never gets out of prison. Also, I want to note that Karen Stitt in 2025 would have been 57 years old. So really not that she still would have had a lot of life left in front of her, and obviously she lost. She was just 15 when this crime happened over 40 years ago.
Yeah, I think one thing about the article that I would like to highlight is Karen's aunt, Robin Stitt Morris, her note about how difficult this all is. Like, Ramirez has, as she said, like, he's lived his entire life, but my niece didn't get that privilege. So I think solving this case was huge. Sure, I know. We know from the podcast, the original podcast that we reviewed or we covered, it brought a lot of, I don't even know, it's no closure. I don't think closure exists. I think we spoke about this in some of our previous episodes when we're dealing with cold cases. It has to bring something. There's some jigsaw piece that at least might be filled in this puzzle, this that the family are dealing with. I don't have the right words to describe it, but there is something that it must bring when he was found. Like, that must have brought something, some feeling, some sense of justice, but not justice itself, to the family. But I just found that line from Karen Stitt's aunt, like, yes, great, he's here. Yes, great, he's pleading no contest. Yes, great. Like, there is benefits to him having been caught, but at the end of the day, he has lived.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they arrested him in Hawaii. He, like we said, he's in his late 70s. He's 78 years old now. And, I mean, he basically lived out his whole life. Part of the reason why it took so long for them to identify him was he had no criminal record. His DNA wasn't in the system. Matt Hutchison, we talked about this in our recap, had to kind of go through some pretty elaborate efforts to get his DNA in order to identify him, which is why it took so long from that tip in 2019 to actually arresting him in 2022. But yeah, you're right. I mean, and the other person that I feel like is right at the center of this and gets quoted in that article is David Woods, who was the boyfriend. And we talked about this in our recap, but I mean, it was interesting. We learned some new things in the story this week about him and kind of what his life has been like since then. We knew, obviously, I mean, he was a suspect from the beginning. He obviously was not involved in this. He was a kid. He was a teenager who was worried about missing curfew, and he went home, and he's had to live with this his whole life. And
I'm sure his parents had to as well. Like, if he wasn't afraid of missing curfew.
Yeah. Well, and he's quoted in the Mercury News as saying, they noted that he was at the hearing on Monday, and that he has actually been at every court appearance, and he lives about 3 hours away with his wife, and he's driven. The both of them have driven to be there for this, and he said he's quoted as saying, "For 40 years, I have suffered the heartache from the horrific loss of a beautiful girl whom I was falling in love with. I hope this brings some closure for her family, myself, and her other loved ones. I've been to every hearing just to represent her, to let her know she's got people here still thinking about her, still hurting from what he did." Which I thought that was a really powerful statement. And I think it speaks to how much this case and how this murder impacted so many lives that he, 40 years later is going so far out of his way just to come to sit there at this hearing.
But I don't feel like that even says about how the murder impacts his life. It's more how Karen Stitt impacted his life, because I'm sure there's plenty of stories like this where the boyfriend or the friends at that stage don't stay on. They don't continue on that friendship or whatever. And I think it says more about him and his character, but also about Karen Stitt as well.
Yeah.
And how highly he thought of her. Which, I mean, they were teenagers in love.
A couple other things I wanted to note. So we heard from Matt Hutchison in the news, and one of the things he said is he talked about how he drives past that murder scene every day on his way to work. He says, this is a quote saying, Matt Hutchison, "I stop at the light and I look over in the direction of where she was found. And it's hard not to get sucked in all the sadness and suffering that she must have gone through. But knowing now, today, that somebody is going to be held responsible, it's a big moment. He also said that he has been contacting law enforcement agencies all over California and Hawaii, everywhere Ramirez has lived, in case that there's possibly other unsolved cold cases, but there haven't been any matches yet. But now that we have his DNA, if there is are there any other cases like this where there's DNA from the suspect on file, but they weren't able to match it because he wasn't previous in the system? So I think that was a great little detail too, that he is hoping to help other families, other cold case detectives find closure and get some justice.
It's very moving. It's like one that I always come back to. I don't know if it's our proximity to the location where Karen Stitt was murdered, and the body was found. It's definitely one that I keep kind of coming back to in my head.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, and I'm not Matt Hutchison, but I also drive past that site most days, and I used to live within a few hundred yards of it, and so like when we first heard about the story, and I didn't know about that when I lived there, but this is definitely one that this is probably one of the stories that we've covered that I think about the most, just because it was so close to home, but it was also such a tragic story that, and so we're talking about Karen and her story, which is the most important thing, but there's that remarkable story of Matt Hutchison, who is also something I feel like we do keep talking about, because he is so persistent. And
well, I feel like we speak about a lot in cold cases, or in cases in general. We're like, we need Matt Hutchison on this. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that is our update on the Karen Stitt case. So like we said, Ramirez pleaded no contest on February 24th. His sentencing will be on May 12th. And we will let you know if there's any other updates in this case or any other ones. If there's any other ones that you would like to hear about, we are constantly monitoring the news for updates on cases we've covered in the past. But let us know in the comments of this episode if there's any other ones you're curious about. We're happy to try to provide an update if we can. And also, before we go, just want to give you a shout out. One place where we do sometimes post updates about stories we've covered in the past, we've had some recent ones in the last few weeks, is on our Patreon, patreon.com/SoMuchCrimeSoloTime. You can sign up for free, and actually updates on past stories are something that free members get access to. So definitely check that out. That's in addition to the bonus content, the outtakes, the early release episodes. So we do occasionally post updates on stories that's just exclusive to our Patreon members.
Thank you. Bye. So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MimeGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Calariso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.